Kia ora, e hoa ma. It is hoa ma. It's kind of funny how everybody is sided to the glass, right? It's kind of attracted to the glass. Thank you so much everyone for coming. My name is Rem Kodebla. I'm the director of Artspace Aotearoa on Karangahape Road. And I'm really super excited about this 1.5 hours that we're going to have here, because I'm joined with amazing colleagues, probably one of the most exciting colleagues that we have. It's going to be funny as well. I hope we're going to have a funny chat. Expectations. Yeah. These series of talks, we have 3 talks that we organize as part of Ngatahi. And Ngatahi is a group of public art galleries in Aotearoa and Tamaki, Makaurau, I do have to say. We have also a stand downstairs where we sell amazing books, which is a project by Judy Miller, although there's not many available anymore, is there, Cameron? I think there's maybe 4 or 5 left, yeah, or 10 left, yeah. This is the first talk of 3, and how I've designed it is pretty simple. So the title, as you see, is A Base of People, which I really hope that we can talk. The idea is we talk very freely, and it's all about embodied experience. And what I really wanted to do is bring colleagues together that can speculate together with me on a couple of very kind of simple topics, really. And the first one is around internationality. Let's not mention COVID, which I just did, because of course when you talk about internationality, that's one of the things that always comes up first. But I think it's more interesting to talk around what can be the demands put on contemporary art and artists and curators if we talk about opening up back to the world in a way. And I wanted to really talk with these people and speculate sort of publicly on what that might mean. Today, then I've asked Ioana Gordon-Smith to lead the panel, so she will take over from me shortly, and then she will question the speakers. And we have also Kimberley Moulton joining us from Melbourne, and we hope that that will all work. Oh, you'll see her on the screen, of course. Hopefully that will all work. So bear with us on a technological aspect. So yeah, but at least then we can have internationality on our screens, right? Although not in real life. So, ngā mihi ki a koutou, ngā mihi ki a koutou hoki. Thank you so much for
Attention visitors. The first talk of the 2021 Talks program, A Base of People, is now on in the mezzanine level of the cloud.
Okay.
That's the Talks program, A Base of People, on the mezzanine level. Thank you.
Okay, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah. So come back tomorrow as well, same time, same channel. Tomorrow we'll be recording these sessions, so I hope that they'll also be available later. Last but not least, really thanks, of course, also towards Stephanie and Haley, amazing art fair team, and the whole Ngatahi group as well. So without further ado, Ioana, I'll leave you to it, and I'll try to sit still here.
Talofa lava. My name's Ioana Gordon-Smith. I'm an arts writer and curator. I'm Samoan from the villages of Leawa'a and Whaleula on my mum's side and English on my dad's side. But I was born and raised here in Aotearoa, and currently I work as the Curator Māori Pacific at Pātaka Art Museum, and am the assistant curator for Yuki Kihara Aotearoa, New Zealand at the 59th Venice Biennale. And I'm really super excited to be here today, and I'm super happy to see you all gathered to join us. And I do want to acknowledge that we are gathering together on Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei land, and I want to Also acknowledge and thank the Auckland Art Fair and Ngātahi, and especially you, Remco, for bringing this panel together, which is a very fierce panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing you all speak, all the expectations and hype. So the topic that we've been given to discuss today is a new imagination on internationality, and hopefully over the course of the next hour or so, we'll work out what that means to each of us. But I do think that there's an implicit Indigenous within that topic. And so I'm really stoked to be joined by three panellists who I think are redefining what's possible and what pathways are open for our Indigenous artists. So very much looking forward to hearing you all today. Hopefully the course of this conversation is very frank and informal, and we really do, rather than waiting for Q&As at the end of the session, we're quite welcoming of questions throughout our conversation. So if anyone has a hot question or not hot question, please feel free to pipe in. But before we continue, if I could ask each of our panellists to introduce yourselves, and if I could start with you, Tim.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Tim Melville. I whakapapatu Te Arawa in Te Aotearoa. I have a stand down here in the fair, and it's quite weird to have got to this point because I lived in London for a long time, for about 20 years, and I came back in 2005 wanting to do something in the art world but not knowing how, and kind of how do you get in. So, opening your own gallery is kind of the nuclear option, but here I am. I've found the experience has been amazing. I've sort of found out who I am through the process of having my gallery for this length of time. It's like 14 years now. And I've grown into this role that I am hoping to continue doing, representing Māori artists and Pacific artists in a way that we feel comfortable with. And the art world is tough, so I want the manaakitanga that can help our artists is something that I'm keen to go forward with. I think that's all I want to say for now.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Nisan Bulavanaka. My name is Emma Tavola. It's an honour to sit next to Tim Melville. I've been a fan as an artist and a curator of Tim Melville's work as a gallerist for a long time, from every form that your gallery has taken. I've been working as an artist curator since 2005 here in Auckland, focused on the area of Manukau City, South Auckland. I work predominantly with contemporary Pacific artists or artists who have a relationship to South Auckland and a relationship to the Moana Oceania region. So yes, I'm Fijian. Maternalistically, I am a fifth generation Pākehā New Zealand settler. And yes, it's an honour to be here. I run a gallery called Vunilangi Vau, which was established in 2019, and I sit in the space between being a dealer, being an advocate, a hustler, and but I think basically I just try to make my practice as an art producer work with being a mum. And that's my main priority. So yes, I relocated my gallery as a result of COVID's impact on the world last year. So in October, I reopened a space in my renovated garage in South Auckland. And we run exhibitions and hold interesting events in a garden in Papatoetoe. COVID Central. Thank you.
You can hold on to that mic.
Okay, Kimberley, my mic.
Kim, could you introduce yourself as...
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's kind of weird. I'm just looking at the panel, so I have no idea who's in the audience. But my name's Kimberley. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of what we know now as Melbourne. But I'm a Yorta Yorta woman, so my people are from northeast of Victoria, in the south of Australia. I am a curator and writer. I work for Museums Victoria, so I'm the senior curator for Southeastern Aboriginal Collections for Museums Victoria, and I'm also Artistic Associate for Rising Festival, which is the Melbourne International Arts Festival. So I have a practice that sits sort of at the intersection of contemporary First Peoples art and also museology and the archive. So I'm really interested in connecting my mob and communities into the museum, into our cultural heritage and ancestral belongings that are within the collections there, but also working with artists in the space of culture, I guess. So that's me. I do sort of lots of other things. I sit, both within an independent practice of contemporary art and curatorial writing as well, and don't like to be defined by the institutions that I work for either. So that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I thought rather than kind of tackle this term internationality head on, it might be good to chat a little bit more about where we locate our practices locally. Because even though Kim's mentioned that she doesn't like to be defined by the institutions, you're all working in quite particular types of art spaces in very specific geographies. So I just wondered if you could talk about what significance locality has on the way that you work and the way that you work with Indigenous artists, or is it not such a determining factor? Like what is the impact of that locality on the way that you work? Tim, if I could start with you again. You're sitting to my right.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start. I mean, that's an interesting question because, locality is, do you mean just where your gallery is, or do you mean the country that you're working in, or do you mean, the region that we're in? But for me, particularly with my relationship with the Aboriginal artists that I work with, I'm interested in how their attitude to country relates so closely to Māori attitudes toward whenua, and the same in the Pacific. It's that idea of custodianship of land and looking after it for the future, and about the concept of being a moment between two eternities. We're just here to look after it for now. That Indigenous cultures share. Australia, New Zealand, and through the Pacific, everywhere. And so in terms of locality, that those attitudes are run throughout. But, one's gallery could be anywhere, even Papatoetoe. That's such an Auckland Central thing to say.
Yes, locality has been the groundstone of my practice. So when I moved to Aotearoa, I moved to, first of all, Mission Bay to stay with some friends in their literal wardrobe. And then I moved to Otara. And so Otara, I moved there when I was 19 years old, and Otara feels like the Pacific. And it felt so connected to home. And I started to, I did my undergraduate degree in Otara, and so you spend 4 years in what was the old Bluebird Chippy factory, in a factory in an Otara industrial subdivision studying fine art, and you walk out the door and the fine art school is next door to SIFS and across the road from factory shops, and you walk down the road and you realize that you can only see Pacific Island people, and you hear our laughter. And I think in Otara, the population is something like 40% under the age of 21. So it's just a completely different landscape. And trying to connect being a practicing artist, studying art, to that environment became the critical question for me. How do we connect those things? So I think my work began when I was at art school, because it was trying to create the language to share a value system that we as Pacific Māori students studying art in Otara needed to not feel like we were on a different planet. And so I started curating as a necessary function of just trying to be relevant within that locality. And so South Auckland became this place that I responded to in my curatorial work and in my art practice. And so it made sense that my first job out of art school was with the council. And I started, Fresh Gallery Aotearoa was the first facility I managed, and understanding, I think, curating as a service, as a community service within the scope of community development was my foundation for my practice, because I think I found my politics, A, in a paid job, and B, in this wonderful space where you could create programming, and on the first day of the new financial year, your budget just replenished. It was an incredibly growthful space, you know. Nigel Burrell and I were both working in that arena, and it was just very empowering and inspiring to think that we could create projects for our communities, in our communities, and be resourced to do it. This was the world pre-global financial crisis, so we did have healthy budgets, and I think, you know, the context as well as Manukau City Council, this is a side note, but basically when the Auckland airport was built, all the regional councils of the Auckland region sold their shares apart from Manukau City Council. So the dividends from Auckland Airport being in Māngere actually funded the arts programming and the facilities that we have in South Auckland. So we have this wonderful landscape where every single suburb has got their own arts centre with their own programming. And we had a really robust arts and culture landscape. So I owe my practice to South Auckland. And so as a Pacific Islander, that role of being a public servant became very aligned with who I am as well, because service is something that is ingrained in us. And so my curatorial practice sort of became this service, and I think it sort of turned into how do we use art to help us as a community reflect on who we are and stimulate dialogue to help us grow and evolve in good ways. So, locality is incredibly important. Now where my gallery is, being in a domestic residential setting, that's really changed the tone as well. So it's been, I'm loving it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's really good. Kim, did you want to add anything onto that question about the impact of locality on the way that you work?
Yeah. I suppose, you know, I think Tim, you sort of touched on, I think, that connection to country, you know, and for mob, for Aboriginal people, and that's so central to our identity and kind of understanding our place in the world. And for me, I'm a guest, so, you know, I mentioned before, I'm Yorta Yorta, but, you know, so that's 2 hours away from Melbourne, where I live and work. And so, you know, part of my practice is always following the protocol here in Melbourne and working with traditional owners here, the Wurundjeri and Woonwurrung, and ensuring that cultural protocol, you know, is really a part of my practice, but also, I guess, connecting back to my own country is very important to maintain those connections and the sort of cultural strength that brings me. But you know, thinking about locality in terms of collections, so much of my work in connecting community into the museum's collection. So the collection that I am curator of have around 4,000 objects, and they range from, you know, the early 1800s right through to today. So a big part of my kind of collection strategy for the collection is addressing the gap of contemporary work, which I don't know if it's probably a common thing across museums, but certainly for the museum I work for, which is the oldest collecting institution in the state, if you were to look at the collection, you might kind of think that the, you know, Aboriginal people aren't, you know, existing beyond the 1950s. So I'm really, you know, wanting to represent our living culture within this space as much as our history. So locating community within the collection is really important, both in a contemporary sense, but also for mob and particularly children. Like I've worked a lot with youth and Victorian Aboriginal childcare agency in connecting kids with the belongings that their old people made, and using that as sort of a link to that cultural strengthening. So, you know, locating the object from the country it comes from, the community into that, and then also, you know, working with artists is a big part of that as well. There's there's a lot of artists that come into the collection and use that as sort of inspiration for their work, and again, this kind of cultural strengthening. So place is so innately connected to identity, and within that is of course protocol, as I spoke to, around working with the traditional owners, but also in I guess connecting collections, connecting histories. Location is everything.
Can you still hear me, Kim? Can you guys
Yes.
hear me if I do this? It sounds like all three of you kind of share an interest in ensuring that your communities are reflected in the arts experiences that you're creating or in the collections that you're curating. And I wanted to pick up on something you said, Emma, about language as being one of those strategies that you use in order to kind of create that reflection, and the idea of finding a language that reflects some shared values. Because I'm always really interested in how Indigenous worldviews are kind of interpreted and translated and spoken about. And I wondered if you guys could maybe talk a little bit about how much of that languaging is really, like what role that languaging plays in your engagement with Indigenous arts.
That's a meaty provocation. I think about the curatorial language, so how an exhibition is framed, how it's delivered, how it's designed. But in that, the most important thing for me is who is the audience. And so I guess it's a form of activism, really, to actively engage non-traditional arts audiences from a Pākehā lens into exhibition making and gallery culture. So I am always thinking about my audience and have always been invested in growing and celebrating and honouring the Pacific Islander audience for Pacific Islander art, because what it feels like in the art world is the more success you experience, the further away you get from your people. And an example of that, for example, it's so wonderful to see some new faces in the shows downstairs and the offerings of the art fair. And one of them is Raymond Sangapolutele, who's a Manirewa, South Auckland-based artist. And I would love for our communities to see you here, because we feel a collective pride to have your representation in this space. So, but what happens is, we know no one will come here. But they'll watch the video and they'll watch our, social media and that kind of thing. But our communities have our backs and feel pride, because as collective people, I think, we take our people with us, but it's awesome when they can actually also be in physical form in the room. Yeah.
Just going from you saying that our people won't come here, that's so harsh, but so true. I know, and it's the same. My audience with my gallery, it's predominantly Pākehā, and they're my friends, and they buy things, they support the artists, they keep the ecosystem going, but to attract a brown audience is hard, because how do you make them feel comfortable in your space? They're not used to engaging with that white cube carry-on that we're kind of used to, because we go to galleries, and it's difficult. I'm like, where's the Māori middle class? Where's the Pacific middle class who are coming in to actually go downstairs and look for artwork for their walls?
Sorry, we didn't mean to look that way.
But it's nice to see some brown faces in this audience. Seriously, I know some of you were corralled in, but and that's the dilemma for both of us. But your audience is different. Your audience, it feels like you are attracting. your people, our people?
Yeah, I think the brown middle class or an art buying market within the Pacific and Māori audience is something that really excites me. I guess it's sort of, in terms of my business plan, it's kind of my target audience for selling work. I love selling work to young professionals.
Can I have your mailing list?
Yes, you may. Because I do things like lay-by, and people take a while to pay things off, and it's awesome. I love seeing work going into South Auckland homes and South Auckland collections, because that work and those ideas and the power of that work then circulates back within our communities and keeps on giving. But that's just, that's an audience that I actively work with. It's not my only audience. I think there's value in what we do for much broader audiences, and in terms of internationality, the international interest in what I do is a lot more potent than what it is within the New Zealand art world. So I was interested in this conversation because, I get asked to talk about shows that I produced in Otahu and Papatoetoe in Hong Kong and Berlin, but rarely in central Auckland or anywhere else in New Zealand.
That's fantastic. You're using your power for good and not evil. You're working for us over there. Yeah, and those connections are hard, but you are super connected internationally. I don't really have that. I've sort of got Australian connections, but people I think will be looking more and more at Aotearoa and seeing how we manage things. COVID we've managed well. Distance looks our way. I think what was that show? That was a show in Seville during in the 90s, the New Zealand exhibition of artwork in Spain in the early 90s was called Distance Looks Our Way, and people are coming, wanting to see how we do it. So Emma's project is really inspirational, and I'm still finding my way. I think I'm on the right track, but I'm still feeling my way through.
Yeah, thank you guys for segueing us into the internationality, because one of my questions was kind of like what your guys' impression is of international demand for Indigenous artists or methodologies even. And Kim, I wanted to ask you, because I know as a curator of collections, a lot of Aboriginal taongas held in overseas collections, a lot of them are held in Europe, and I know that you've done a program, I think the Accelerate program, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that relationship between, international museums looking at Australia for expertise, or kind of what happens there when collections are already international.
Sorry, I caught a little bit of that, and someone's cutting a tree down the front of my house, so apologies if it's loud. I've done quite a bit of work in international collections, looking at southeastern Aboriginal materials. So that's New South Wales, Victoria, down the southeast coast of Australia, and there was a huge amount of collection that happened in the 19th century, ongoing really, of our cultural material. And many of the things that the museums have, in Europe and the UK, America as well, we don't even have as people ourselves anymore, or that practice is in the process of being, revived. So my work in going over there was to connect, first and foremost, to connect to those objects from my ancestors. There's been cases where, in Scotland, in like the middle of Glasgow, in museums, in all these random places where I've connected to objects from my country, and I've been the first, Aboriginal person that's touched them since they were kind of taken, or collected from Australia and from their homes, in 1840 or whenever it was. So there's this sort of spiritual connection, cultural protocol that I go through when I'm going into these places to ensure that the object, and I'm sure people understand this sometimes when I talk about this, especially in a museum with anthropologists or whatever, eyes roll. But this is how I've been taught from my family as well. It's very important to honour and respect those objects, and they aren't just innate thing sitting in a tomb. You know, they're actually alive, and they mean something to our people. So connecting to them is really important. Then for me, and part of my research with Accelerate, with the British Council, and then I've done further research after that as well, is about understanding the relationship the institution has to the object. So what does the curator or the keeper of that collection understand in terms of the living connections and the living culture that object still maintains to community? And then conversations of loan, of repatriation, of interpretation, and that, you know, Emma, you're talking about, you know, voice, or the curatorial voice and the institutional voice, and that's really important. You know, like who's talking in these spaces and who's talking about our objects or our art, and how is it being represented? You know, and in a lot of places I've been, it might be the British Museum, although that's getting better, but there's actually Gay Sculthorpe is there, who's a Tasmanian Aboriginal woman. She's the senior curator of that collection now, so that's getting better there. But there's places that just don't even interpret our history correctly, let alone, you know, in a progressive contemporary way. So there could be little changes like that made, but yeah, I'm kind of rambling now. But yeah, I'm interested in, I guess, the language, the international dialogue between mob, you know, so, you know, Aboriginal people between, you know, mob from New Zealand, Māori people from New Zealand, or I've done work in Norway with Sami and First Nations Canada. You know, we're working together, Ioana, at the moment on this deadly show with our First Nations kin in Canada. So like what's the conversations and the language between mob at that kind of meta, like collective level in international forums? I'm kind of keen to explore that more.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the central questions for this discussion, is like, what do our arts need to be supported internationally or outside of potentially their home contexts? And those nation-to-nation connections, I think, are a really interesting way of navigating that. And Tim, you've worked with Aboriginal artists and presented their work here, and I'm thinking of your show, is it Ngā Iwi Moemoeā? So I wondered if you could talk through what it means to bring Aboriginal artists to an Aotearoa context, and what kind of is involved in ensuring those works have as much support here in Aotearoa as they might have in their own homes or their own Neverlands.
Aboriginal art is still seen here as other. You know, it's like New Zealanders don't really understand it very well, and they, I think perhaps because we see a lot of dot paintings at airports, you know, and so there isn't really any connoisseurship here about what's good and what's not good. So the work that I bring into the country, I edit it for our audience. I bring in work that I think New Zealanders will find an entry point with. For example, the artists at Warman. I remember having a light bulb moment at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and I saw this huge black and white painting by Mabel Julie, crescent moon and star. You know, we call them moon and star dreamings, but Gankini Ngarangani in their Gidja language from Western Australia, they're in the East Kimberleys. And this painting just absolutely struck me. It's at a formal level, but then when you start to think about what that painting was and the story that she was telling, her story about the moon being a man and being in love with a particular woman that he wasn't allowed to marry because she was technically his mother-in-law. Very forgive me, Kimberley, the skin groups and it's complicated relationships so he was very angry when the woman he loved he couldn't be with, and he went up onto a mountain and he cursed the people, and he said to them, "You will all die. You're all going to die. You'll just be white bones. But I'll come back every month for 3 nights, and I'll be with the woman I love. So it's this beautiful story that we all relate to at a human level, and it's an ancient story that she's still telling. So although I was attracted to the work formally, I was pulled into her life and her people, and this is, Aboriginal people have been making up for 60,000 years on that island. We're new here. It's really old over there. So my job is to try and translate some of the connections for our people on this side of the ditch, and to show where we're cousins, and we have so much to learn from each other. But I have, a commercial imperative as well. I've got to, it's hard. I mean, I'm downstairs in that Shark Tank, and so it's quite nice being up here. But it's so I kind of have to walk these two worlds. I want to do it properly. I want to honour the artist's work. I want to connect, but I have to have a commercial head on as well to make sure that my gallery doors can remain open. And so, as I was saying, this black and white Mabel Julie painting, I thought New Zealanders do black and white. We know how to do that. We love that. And that painting got such a response when I brought some of Mabel's works into the gallery. And so this has been the way to get her work and to get the other works by artists from Mormon. And then I've gone on to other communities as well, and I've kind of tried to find the things that I think New Zealanders will understand. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but I love them all, and I hope that people trust my eye and sort of limited connoisseurship that I've built up so far over, perhaps 10 or 12 years. So that's how I see my job in that go. Yeah.
Maybe on a marae or a more natural kind of position. So one really good thing I thought about that exhibition was it explained to me through contemporary art, the concept of the nothingness, the no, and I thought that was extremely effective. But I think what I'm asking is where Indigenous or First Peoples art is being translated or created for basically, I suppose, a European context of a gallery or an institution, how does that collide or collaborate when some of those images or imagery might be quite sacred, and yet they're going into a commercial space, or they're being collected as some kind of ethnic object? I mean, I don't know what that road is, and I guess the other one on from that is who defines who is an Indigenous artist in the Western sense? Is it galleries? Is it museums? Is it the community itself?
You thought my questions were heavy.
It's multi-layered.
I think the incredible survey show at Auckland Art Gallery at the moment is an important framing of how we see the exhibition, is that Auckland Art Gallery's commitment as a treaty partner means that is not a European space, that Māori deserve to be there, and that exhibition is long, we've been waiting for a long time. The fact that they had Nigel Burrell curate that show for the last 3 or 4 years, I think he's been working on it. It's the biggest survey show. It has over 300 artworks in it, over 100 artists. the fact that he's been able to create the narrative that you encountered the exhibition from Te Kore, you know, that's all pretty incredible stuff. He has been changing the system from inside. So what he's been able to do with that work and with that exhibition is to create a Māori space within an institution that owes a debt to tangata whenua. So it's a profound moment, that exhibition, and I know that for audiences I have spoken to, they feel very present in that space. They feel like they belong there because of that exhibition, because of the exhibition language, and because of Nigel Burrell's intention to make Māori audiences feel like they are being honoured, that Te Ao Māori is being honoured through that act of curating an exhibition. So exhibitions like that, leadership, curatorial leadership like Nigel Burrell's leadership, changes the landscape of these, I think, colonial institutions, that they are being forced into a place where they have to reckon with the power imbalance that comes as a colonial hangover.
And I thought that the way it was curated was really that it curated by concepts or by particular moments. I think what I was kind of trying to ask is, as an Indigenous artist, how, in terms of things, we're talking about tradition, protocol, and yet to be viable, it has to be translated into some kind of another lens, to get viewed through another lens. Is that a conflict, or is that a process where I can talk, or one can talk about these issues in a way that it maybe is understandable to Palangi or Pākehā? I don't know. Is that something you think about, I suppose?
Well, I'm just going to quickly answer part of that. There's a responsibility to show work in a way that respects the work. Whether you're a Pākehā artist or a Māori artist or a Pacific artist, you have to show it with respect, and I would say with aroha as well. When you're showing work by Indigenous artists who, I'm thinking about some of the what you mentioned about sacred knowledge, and here then it goes into a white gallery, and then it's commodified. I mean, that's the world. It's awful, and I'm in that world. I'm implicated. But when I'm showing a work by particularly the Aboriginal artists, that work that they send to me is probably their only source of income. These remote Aboriginal communities are engaging with the market to support their whānau and their families and extended families. And in a painting that I might sell, perhaps by Mabel Julie, the 60% that goes to her goes to the Arts Centre. Some of that will come from the Arts Centre to cover materials. The rest will go to Mabel, but from Mabel it will go to probably, she's supporting a large whānau. Kimberley, you're much more aware of how this sort of thing works.
Yeah, can you just, I've been catching bits and I can't actually hear the questions from the audience, but I heard something around, the commodification of Aboriginal art when it's going into a commercial space. Is that the sort of question?
Yeah, it's around that area.
Yeah.
And how ethically the work is sold and translated, and how the money works with art centres. Yeah,
I think also, when it comes to Aboriginal art, whether that be Aboriginal artists like Mabel from remote communities, or whether that be Aboriginal artists that are based in urban environments, or urban, the city, like you just said, Tim, it is an economy. It is a way of making money as much as it is a cultural, creative expression. And I think, with regional artists coming in, one can't assume that they don't have agency and that they're not in control of this as well. I mean, there has been, of course, exploitation and everything that's happened in the past, but a lot of artists like Mabel, who was one of the, best artists in Australia. I love her work. Got a Mabel in my bedroom. I won't show you now, but, she's wonderful. And, they're creating work because they want to share their arts practice and their cultural stories, but also, they've got autonomy and agency over that decision as well. And, as long as that respect is taken in with the gallerist, but also the institution. And it's not up to the institution to define what Aboriginal art is, although that has been a problem, particularly in the southeast of Australia. For many years, Victorian and New South Wales artists weren't acquired and weren't collected by major state institutions because they weren't seen as authentic enough. And, the kind of real Aboriginal art was happening in, the Western Desert or Central Desert or Northeast Arnhem Land. And so that kind of representation has been a problem for years, and that's shifting, quite dramatically now. And, like urban artists from the cities are sort of getting a look into this space in terms of what is Aboriginal art. But we define what Aboriginal art is. The community define what our arts practice is and, how we want to share our culture. It's no longer the institution or the anthropologist or the non-Indigenous curator that, has that control anymore. It's shifting, the power is shifting, I think. I don't know if that was in relation to what was being said, but I'm picking up on words.
Yeah, that was really great, Kim. Because the last comment was that it's problematic to see culture as a singular thing, that when it gets translated into and adapts and creates new senses of agency within institutions, it is still culture. It is a constantly evolving, re-manifesting beast, and it's problematic to ever think that doing it differently is losing something, because we're constantly evolving and adapting. We're incredibly resilient, adaptive peoples. And so what Nigel has done with the exhibition is created an exhibition language for that adaptation within that space. I think that's a really lovely comment about agency, Kim. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like within and I think exhibition too, I think that some of the most successful pieces were the things that were using completely contemporary materials, mediums like video and things, so that constant adaptation, but reworking traditional things, but in a totally different context. I think that was a really successful thing of that exhibition as well. Yeah.
I have an artwork on my 2 screen prints downstairs on my stand by Nungana Marawili, who is one of the finest Aboriginal artists, who's a bark painter primarily from Northeast Arnhem Land. And they have a policy, a kaupapa, at Buku, which is in Yokala where they work, that everything that they make must come from the land. So they paint on bark, they use ochre, it's natural materials, even paper. But recently some really crazy colours have started to appear, like hot pink and cyan blue, and how does that square? And they said, oh no, that comes from the land. This is recycled printer toner from landfill. So they've found the wormhole in, and they're using this really contemporary material. And this is one of the things I love about Aboriginal painting. It's so versatile. There are so many different things happening all over that vast continent. I mean, we're tiny here, but there's so much creativity and so many different ways of making it. And making work on steel. I mean, this up in Yokala, they're particularly inventive. But yes, contemporary materials. Would you go along with that, Kimberley?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch the last bit of that, but yeah, I did hear that. And Boku, like Northeast Arnhem Mob, are just doing the most incredible work, and Nongringa, you know, in her bark paintings. But then they've got this whole media centre that's attached to the cultural centre, and there's a thing called the Mulka Project, which is producing the most extraordinary filmmakers and new media artists as well for Australia. So, you know, Aboriginal art is not you know, not rooted in the historic past. It's informed by our history, but we are creating the most contemporary and you know, progressive works in the country. And I think, you know, going back to what you were talking about with Nigel's exhibition, which I haven't been able to see yet, but I've been checking out online. It just sounds and looks incredible. But it's around like this idea of indigenising space through our voice. And Stephen Gilchrist, who's a Yamachi curator in Australia, you know, he speaks, has written a lot about, you know, creating spaces for Indigenous people, not just of Indigenous people. And that's, I think, when that language shifts is when, yeah, we have our own voice within these spaces. And also, you know, Tim, going back to what you were talking about before in terms of Aboriginal art and also, you know, First Peoples art really, and we have a responsibility as curators and gallerists and people working in and out of the institution. Like I'm working also for a major state festival, so it's a very ephemeral kind of way of curating and working with artists, but sits out of that white cube space. Yeah, but we have a responsibility to actually educate the broader audience on what our artists are doing, you know, so it's not just, Aboriginal art isn't just all about dot paintings or you know, what people might assume to be that. Aboriginal art is, you know, crazy light installations and whatever else, but that's kind of that role of the visual language that we can work with the artists, yeah.
Which is the same thing that's happened with Toi Tu Toi Ora, Nigel's show. It's not just ko whai whai. It's that whole gallery is filled with so many, like Māori art is at the centre. And, you know, the Pākehā art kind of is othered in that space at the moment. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Can I ask something to all of you? Maybe just to speculate a bit more around the future, not looking at now too much or back, but speculating more around the future. Because what I find so interesting is that you all are in a, also you, Kimberley, you all seem to be in it very much for the long haul, right? So if we think about collections, for example, Kimberley working in a museum, but also you, Tim, kind of really thinking through, okay, what is a longevity in which I work, right? So we're really wanting to kind of infect, if you will, or inject, I have to say. Not infect is really not a good word, but inject these works in people's living room, right? I mean, that's kind of a clear goal. Or also with you, Emma, if you even think about like the small things that you sell, or the kind of the long haul that you think about through your practice, but also actually also you, Ioana, thinking through your curatorial practice. I'll make you an addition to this as well. But can you speculate a bit more around the future and how important it is that if you build something up, like a collection or a thing that can sustain itself over a longer term period, what happens when it starts to, because the promise for me in that is that a thing like that can travel, or the knowledge that sits within that can travel, right? We're talking about Toi Tu Toi Ora, but one of the critiques that I would have of it, can we look at how much of that is acquired for the collection of Toyo Tamaki? I think we'll find that when this exhibition goes down, very little of it will remain in the collection, right? So how important are those kind of lengths of thinking? And can you speculate what that will do in the future, whilst we're now in an environment, of course, that we feel that we think about the local and very short, temporary kind of ways in which we are not able to connect to the world again, right? So for me, thinking about the long term and collections, for me, is like really an amazing opportunity to reconnect to the world, right? So is that something that you could all speculate more about?
Well, I think there has been a shift. Just with the opening of that single exhibition, it feels like there has been a shift. And I don't know what it is, but suddenly it's like this, it's like the veil has lifted, and we can see work that we saw bits and pieces here and there. And so it was sort of crumbs, if you like. A little bit in a group show there, and there's a bit of this one, but suddenly there they all are together, and the sum is greater than the total is greater than the sum of its parts. It has a power, and so this work by Māori artists has been looked at in a different way. And so it's a long game. The cultural change doesn't happen overnight, but I think a switch has gone on, and we'll be looking in a different way at the work of Māori and Pacific artists in this country. And I mean, Aboriginal artists maybe not quite yet, but you know, I'm working on that. But there's people are looking for something extra, and Indigenous artists, I think, have a connection still to values that might have been forgotten. But even old knowledge is being re-evaluated. Yeah.
Kind of forgotten the question, but longevity. Yeah. Well, like I've been collecting art for about 20 years, and I've just started to, well, actually during lockdown, I am saying I've just rehung my collection at home and did some really bold curatorial shows in each bedroom. But I also decided that it was time for some work to leave my collection. So found ways to rehome it. And this is why I love selling art, because I love collecting art, I love buying art. So I think when I look at collections as a sort of archive of time, I've collected, you know, my art history, basically. But I have buyers who, when I was managing Fresh Gallery Otara, there was a wonderful buyer who'd buy every single, she'd come on the first day of every show, which was hard because it was the day after the opening, and she'd buy the work which we would promote the show with. And so I'd go to her house to deliver work every couple of months, and she had collected my art history. Really, every show I'd curated. I did 66 shows at Fresh, and she had almost a piece from every show. So, this is what I love about, I love about the art market and the act of collecting, because I think in people's homes, we have these little insights into the worlds that they've intersected with, but for, you know, there's a pretty niche market for collecting contemporary Pacific art. But yeah, I think when you sort of tap into the domestic market for art buying and don't think about the institutions and what they are and are doing, we've got little bubbles of collections and archives of our longevity and our presence all over the place. In terms of longevity, in terms of being a gallerist and an arts manager, I don't think I can do anything else. I've burnt so many bridges that this is sort of where I've ended up. So, I heard that about you. Kate Pai.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
What's the future?
Oh, gee. I reckon the future, I want to see more like mob-run galleries. Yes. Kimber Thompson, who's a Aboriginal woman in Melbourne, she has a gallery called Black Dot Gallery, and works really closely with Pacific and Aboriginal artists. And that's really exciting to see that there's a gallery that's run by mob for mob in town. So I think definitely seeing more of that. And of course, more people in institutions. Like I'm the only Aboriginal curator for Museums Victoria, which, you know, is difficult, but also it's 2021. And I know, you know, the institution is sort of trying to address that. But this is not an isolated thing in Australia. There are very few Aboriginal curators, you know, across the board in institutions. So growing that and kind of finding ways to bring in new people in these spaces and community is so important. So I think, and I'm really interested in kind of getting challenging and moving past this binary, like working in a museum, which is does have contemporary collections, but is more of a historical kind of museum, but challenging this space of what's museum and what's art gallery, because so much of what I do with the historical collections is informing contemporary practice, and it's always been that way. And so kind of more pushing the boundaries in these spaces of museum and contemporary art.
I'll just add on to that. Thank you, Kim. One of the things that I would like to see in the future is, of course, the massive repatriation of Pacific cultural heritage, which sits in European museums and Anglo-American museums all over the world. Fijians are fortunate. We're the only country in the Pacific that has the largest collection of our own cultural objects in Fiji. But every other country in the Pacific, the majority of their taonga are in these museums, which are quite hard to access. That story, Kim, you shared about being the first Aboriginal person who touched or engaged with these objects. When I engaged with our Fijian tattoo tools in Cambridge a couple of years ago, our largest collection of tattoo instruments sits in boxes in Cambridge. We don't have the practice anymore. We don't have the cultural memory of the practice anymore. These objects are the anchors to the revival that we're trying to do. When I encountered those objects, I felt like they'd been in prison. What decolonizing the museum feels like it needs, what that space feels like is that it's no longer about social inclusion strategies to get our communities into those spaces. It's about reckoning with the theft and the looting, which is the basis of a lot of those Indigenous collections, and repatriating, investing in those source countries to enable them to house and home and reconnect those objects with the people they come from. So that's a really strong agenda for me, and Vengia tattoo practice has really taken me into that space. And from some international talks, being in Berlin, talking about decolonizing the museum, there's this international movement of what does that look like, which is interesting, because I think the conversation in Germany is very different from the conversation that we can have in the British Empire. But I think museums are trying to reckon with that at the moment. The African Museum in Brussels, I went to school next to it for 10 years of my life, and it's one of the most horrific examples of a museum with an African collection. Belgium's colonial impact is horrific, but things are changing in the museum space, but they need to change radically. And it is about source community-led activity, I think.
Yeah, and communities are ready. We're ready. The thing that frustrates me, I think, I've been working in this space now for about 12 years, and there's been some movement, in the context of repatriation and museums opening up to that in the international context. But it just takes so long, and it's like, well, you got to catch up to us because we're ready. In many cases, there's still work to be done, I think, in terms of keeping places and communities being ready to take things home. And, there's a lot of work, but, why is it taking years and years and years and years just even to have the conversation? And I'd like to see movement happening sort of faster in that space as well. Yeah.
The conversation is also economic. The value of those objects, the value of those collections is the reason those museums are open.
That's right.
Those collections are leveraged for loans, which fund new exhibitions, which fund new programming. Our cultural heritage is funding the museum sector in a lot of different ways. And that needs to be recognized in terms of recognizing the source communities of those objects.
she's wild. But no, that thing that you said, Kimberley, about mob-led galleries, mob-owned galleries, it's telling your own story in your own way, which Emma is totally doing in Papatoetoe, and I'm doing in a way, in a more kind of, I'm having to stand in two worlds with my own gallery. But we have a gallery that's about to open here in Aotearoa, the Waro Māori Art Gallery in Whangarei. Will be opening at the Hundertwasser Art Centre on December the 2nd. And I'm a trustee on the board for that. In fact, there's another trustee here. Kia ora, Carl. That's the first public Māori art gallery there has been. And look, it's 2021, it's taken so long, but at last we have a gallery. It's small, but, we'll take it. And it's going to be for Māori artists and Māori curators. So for Māori, by Māori. And this is another example of the shift. There's been a shift. And I'm optimistic that we're moving in the right direction.
That's a great bombshell. That's a great ending, I think, no?
Yeah, I think so.
No, that's great responses. And I think, if is there any more questions from the audience?
Emma, I just wanted to talk to you about art schools, because obviously we met in an art school in South Auckland, and it's awesome, and I've seen you present internationally as well, and it's fantastic what you've been doing with the gallery, and I'm a big supporter. But I just wanted to ask you about the loss of the art school in South Auckland, and how you think, because I guess I see a lot of the crew around the gallery for you are ex-students from MIT, and obviously there's a whole new generation as well, but there's some really core people there that went through MIT and got their art degrees there. How do you think that's affected the community, the fact that the art school isn't there anymore, and how do you think other art schools are doing in that space?
That's a good question. Thank you, Anne. We had a period of time, an art period in South Auckland, where Manukau Institute of Technology, our dominant tertiary provider, had a partnership with the University of Auckland, so delivered a Bachelor of Visual Arts program, which sat outside of Elam, but part of the same extended family. And a lot of us went through this program. It was called Manukau School of Visual Arts, I think established in the late 90s, and when the University of Auckland left the relationship with MIT, they tried to evolve what was MSVA into an MIT faculty called the Faculty of Creative Arts. Bringing it in line with MIT meant transforming the program to be more aligned with a polytechnic academic framework. So technically, functionally, about training artists to get jobs, which I think sort of reflects a bit of a shift in arts education over the last decade, perhaps. But the period of MSVA was really interesting because we were this Auckland University degree program in Otara, where we had lots of freedoms. We had a phenomenal staff body. I always credit Paul Cullen for kind of facilitating my connection to Otara because of the residency program that he led, working with artists with social practice in the early 2000s. And that was quite boundary pushing back then, but through Paul and MSVA's leadership, bringing in artists who could connect us as students with the international art world, as well as with Otara as a site, was really important. And so there is this alumni of MSVA who feel very sad that MIT has now cut all creative arts from their offerings as an institution, but simply because I think But, you know, we all know when you had come out of art school with an art degree, it does not equal jobs. And so it was a problematic program for MIT because you have, on the same hand that they offer a Bachelor of Creative Arts, they offer a Diploma of Logistics, which has like a 99% employment rate on the day that you finish the course. And so a huge spectrum of difference. But yeah, we, as a community of graduates from MSVA who are still living in South Auckland, have definitely pulled together to share our grief for the end of that school, to sometimes do drive-bys and have a box in the car park because it's still unlocked. And I'm actually producing a show next month with Antonio Filippo, a Tokalauan graduate from MSVA, and last year produced the show with Vea and Emily Mafaleo. So we are building relationships because it's gone that maybe wouldn't have happened without its demise. But a very important part of our art history in South Auckland. I know Whitecliff has now got a base in Manukau. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The role of arts education in the South Auckland creative ecology has changed. The graduates that came out of MSVA ended up doing all sorts of things. I mean, Antonio Filippo came out with a Bachelor of Visual Arts and went and worked for Trade and Exchange magazine. Like the amount of graduates who actually went into arts-related employment was mixed. But yeah, having places like Fresh Gallery Otara, Vunilangi Vo, we bring them out of the woodwork and they come back, and we're actually showing a beautiful series of Antonio's drone photography of Otara at a new coffee shop in Otara called the Alexander Cafe, just to again recognize the site and the space of Otara as where MSVA, you know, nurtured our practices. So we're still around, but it's, I grieved hard for its closure. But I also did a guest lecture to the Faculty of Creative Arts before its demise, and it was at, they moved over to North Campus. It was in a classroom that was normally used for like accounting or something, and it was the most depressing thing I've ever done. So I was sort of like, it should die, because this is no longer a creative arts school. So, you know, sometimes it's good. Renew, refresh.
Great, thanks Emma for that. If there's no more questions, then I think we should draw to a close, because I think you've deserved a drink. No, I really want to thank you, ngamihi kia koutou, ngamihi kia koe Kimberley on the... Can you hear me? Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And we did quite well on the technical front, I think. So thanks for bearing with us. Thank you, Emma, Tim, and Ioana for doing a wonderful job here. And thanks so much for all of the amazing work that you do way beyond this panel. So ngamihi kia koutou. Thank you. So tomorrow we're back, same time, same channel, with Ngahiraka Mason talking, Cameron is talking tomorrow, and Nigel Burrell and Ashley Taupaki. So join us tomorrow if you're here. For now, have a wonderful evening. Thank you.